We're going to be talking about Dr. Enright's 4 phases of forgiveness. And then I've got a little forgiveness thing that I'd like to share with you. And again, this is for your use. And if you want, you can copy this and have a PDF of it. Sometimes it's on my website. So please utilize all of these tools. Forgiveness in grief. Dr. Robert Enright's 4 phases of forgiving and accessing forgive, the acronym for forgive. And that's mine. Enright's 4 phases of forgiving and why they're important to grief relief and release. So when you think about forgiving and grief, what's the big deal? You know, what's hard about forgiving, and why is it even a thing? It's actually one of my phases, forgiveness. And it stands on its own because forgiveness is a big thing. Society at large doesn't tend to want to forgive what they're grieving, or issues that have come up, or people who have hurt them. Sometimes it's easier for some people to just say, I'm out of here. And we're really not given the tools to integrate a conversation around forgiveness. So let me share a story around JJ. JJ, she was grieving the loss of her marriage. And it was traumatic as well because her husband was into pornography. And as a result of that, he was imprisoned. She not only lost her husband to pornography and to prison, she was dealing with the shame and grief of having been married to a man who she didn't know was doing the things he was doing. And she had 2 children at home, 2 young boys. She was happy they weren't girls. And she was furious. She was hurt. She felt such shame that she actually became a shut-in. And she would only allow certain people in. However, her boys needed to have friends. And she made sure that they socialized, but their house was always a house where kids would come and gather. And so this was a complicated grief. It was a complicated trauma. And I tell you this because oftentimes there are layers of grief that we don't understand. And we look at it from one level, but so often there are so many other levels. And she knew that she couldn't live with the degree of angst that she was feeling, number one, toward her husband, and toward herself for not recognizing who he was, and that he wasn't the person she thought she had married. She knew when we started to talk about forgiveness that she wasn't ready. And yet it was a conversation that continually needed to be brought up. And the reason behind bringing it up, the reason behind going back to it again and again and again. And I don't know if you remember the slide of the brain and the labyrinth, and the slide said repetition, repetition, repetition. This is where repetition, repetition, repetition comes in. Because JJ was walking around with such rage and shame that it was eating her up. She'd lost 20 pounds that she really didn't need to lose. She'd stopped eating. She'd stopped sleeping. Her hair was falling out. These are all manifestations of trauma, shame, and grief. And they're not a pretty mix. And because she was not able to go into the conversation around forgiveness, she was like living in the bile of it. There's no other better way to describe it. And sometimes as clinicians, we need to enter the ugliness, the bile of it, because it's not pretty. And we may want to go blind, and we might unconsciously do so. To have a format around forgiveness can really help you engage in a controlled way, in a way that brings some relief to your own psyche, because sometimes the stories we hear and hold are disgusting, are hard, and may also bring up things within us that we have not yet dealt with. And we didn't even know that we haven't dealt with them, which is why Enright's phases are vastly important. They're go-tos for us, for our clients, and their release of grief. So he talks first about the uncovering. And the uncovering is when, there's this sense of injustice, to say the least, in JJ's case, right? And it's an injury to the soul, definitely what JJ felt. And it's an injury to the sense of self, and its effects, like in JJ's case, can be far-reaching. The ownership of the feelings is the entire intro into healing and being. So first, it's uncovering is like being in discovery. And that being in discovery and uncovering can take a while for many reasons. One, you uncover something, and what is remembered when you uncover is often not the whole story. The story comes out in pieces, just like grief. It's a mosaic, and trying to figure out what are the missing pieces. And those pieces come out over time, and the clues come in over time. So as JJ was beginning to uncover, she was beginning to remember clues that she had gone blind to, because it wasn't in her idea of who she was married to. And then we come to the decision phase, the second phase. And when confronted with the decision to release the self from further injury, and that's what this is, it's the decision that's made between you and the client, because the client has got to feel that you're with them, and you're with them 100%. And that they've got a witness, not in a fused state, but that that the decision to release the self from further injury is what this is about. Because if the decision is not made, then the client is continually self-harming by holding on to what they've been holding on to around the situation. And the emotional harm is persistent. It's a knock on a door that doesn't stop. It's a dripping from a pipe that you can't find, and the drip just doesn't go away. And you need to help the client make the decision to stop the drip, which is exactly what JJ and I decided to do to help her stop the drip, was to make the decision to begin the release. And that meant when a memory came in, she'd say, okay, there's nothing I can do about what was, but I can do something about what is. And what is that I'm not with him anymore. He is in prison, and my children are safe. And then Enright goes right to the work, understanding the human side of the injury. So this is empathy. And it is very hard to have empathy, in JJ's case, for her husband. But when we began to understand where he came from, which again, she was like, This doesn't matter. I'm going to love this guy no matter what. It didn't matter what he came from. It didn't matter the abuses he went through in his life. None of that matters. I'm going to marry this guy and I'm going to love him, and my love will be enough. And yet, to have empathy for where you were blind and then uncover that, in JJ's case, uncover the past and the history of her husband, began to help her forgive the little boy that was her husband, who got so badly hurt that became the predator he became. Now, predators don't form because they were hurt, but his brain got so damaged that he became who he became as a result of the injuries that he experienced from being beat up time and time and time again. And so she began to have that empathy, and that empathy allowed her to have greater distance. So instead of being over-distanced or under-distanced, she began to calibrate. And then there was a deepening, and that deepening was an ownership of her new purpose, and she began to gain weight, and she began to allow her door to be open to friends and family, and she began to refurbish her life and live again. And she cut her hair, and she changed where she lived, and she became a much more differentiated self. Would I wish this on anyone? No. And yet, she was probably more in a diffused state when she married him. And through this process, her fusion became less, and she began to really tease out her more differentiated state of being. And so you can see the work of fusion and differentiation within Enright's 4 phases. And now I'd like to just introduce you to my short overview of forgiveness. So this is my breakdown. The F is to find a definition for forgiveness for yourself and for your clients. The O is order and modulate your own responses to forgiveness, just like JJ. The R is to regroup how you think about loss and grief and forgiveness. The G is to give yourself a break and to breathe so that you can begin a new storyboard. The new storyboard, I shared JJ's new storyboard about forgiveness and how she went through those 4 phases. Your client can also begin a new storyboard as they go through the 4 phases of forgiveness. A storyboard is that projective story. What do I want my life to look like now that I have gone through the 4 phases, or even before the 4 phases? If I forgave, what would my life look like? If I wasn't in a constant state of shame, rage, and grief, and trauma, what would my life look like? And that's what a new storyboard or storyboards are about. The I is invigorate the soul and find ways to be safe. And safety is going to be different for everyone. It's going to be different for the introvert or the extrovert, or even someone who needs to just be calibrated. That safety could be, let me get onto a seesaw. V is vectors are paths you choose. So the vectors for forgiveness are going to be different for everyone. They're pathways, and there can be a splitting of pathways, and you might meander, and you might find that there are places where you or your client just stop, and it's like the maze in the brain where there are dead ends. And if you or your client reach a dead end while going through the forgiveness phase, that's fine. take a break and allow yourself to recenter and then go back and see what are the paths we choose. And then E is energize healing by avoiding the lure of a vengeful mindset, because that does a few things you don't want. Keeps you blind, keeps your client blind, keeps your client stuck in their grief and in their trauma and in their stories that they really want to release. In the next section, we're going to be talking about something I've referred to pretty consistently throughout all of the modules, which is about anxiety and anger. And this is what we're going to be talking about in the next section.